The way to get wealthy is to allow foreigners to sell you stuff cheaply. If you allow foreigners to sell you stuff cheaply, it raises your living standards. The reason why here in London or people in America have high living standards is because they're able to buy stuff from China, from Japan, from Korea, from India, from each other, from pretty much anywhere around the world.
Hello and welcome to the IATP YouTube channel. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Whetstone Scholar. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Douglas Carswell. Douglas is a former politician who served as a Member of Parliament from 2005 to 2017. And he's currently President and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, a leading American think tank. Douglas sits on the Advisory Council of the Institute of Economic Affairs and on the Advisory Council here at the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity. Douglas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Reem. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. So I was wondering if you could first talk a little bit about what life was actually like for you growing up in Uganda.
It was a little different to life in the UK in the 2020s. Growing up in Uganda in the 1970s and 1980s, for a start, we had a military dictator, Idi Amin. There was quite a lot of upheaval, I think you would euphemistically call it. Genocidal warfare might be a more accurate description. But weirdly, as a child growing up there, it was sort of an idyllic childhood in the sense, you might find that slightly odd, but I was just a regular child who enjoyed doing outdoor things. And if you like the outdoors, there's no greater place to grow up outdoors than Uganda. It was a wonderful place to grow up, very, very happy memories. But there was always this background of turmoil. It was always sort of ever present upheaval, economic and political upheaval.
And how do you think that economic and political upheaval sort of shaped your worldview altogether? I mean, living under that kind of a regime and obviously seeing the way in which both politics and economics sort of occurred in that way. I mean, how do you think that shaped your worldview?
Long before I had ever heard the word economics or could spell the word economy, I knew that government intervention in what I now understand is the economy is a bad thing. And it came about very simply. We had a president who took control of things. He nationalised the sugar industry. And as a child, I remember driving past overgrown fields where no one was gathering in the sugarcane, and there was a chronic shortage of sugar. You couldn't find sugar or basic commodities in downtown Kampala for love nor money. I learnt at a very early age that if the government prints money, inflation, you destroy the market system. Literally, we had a market in downtown Kampala that stopped taking currency because inflation was so chronically high. In fact, at one stage, people would use handfuls of charcoal and plastic biro pens, plastic biro pens filled with salt as units of exchange because the currency had completely collapsed. So I think as a young child growing up in Uganda, I learned very early on that when the government takes control, when it fixes prices, when it tries to control economic activity, it ends in disaster. And so I would find it hard to think that someone could have had that experience and not grow up in favour of free markets and small government.
That's really interesting. And do you think, so obviously that's shaped the way in which you view the world yourself, but also the way in which you think the solutions, the sort of pathways to solutions for these kind of elements of economic control as well. Do you think then that, when we think about Africa as a continent as a whole, of course, we talk about Africa, but we often talk about Africa as though it is a homogenous continent, when in reality there are so many different varieties to the way in which the economics and the politics intertwine, but also interchange with one another and how they behave. Do you think that free markets are the solution to all African nations' problems, or?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, if you want the absolute slam dunk vindication for the free market, go and look at a country like Uganda or Rwanda today. I mean, I've been back to Uganda fairly recently, and it's totally different to the country I grew up in. There's an enormous amount of wealth and prosperity. There's a bustle about the place. Everyone is involved in a business of some kind. In other words, once you got rid of a tyrannical government and you stopped doing all these absurd things of nationalising the economy and controlling economic activity, human nature, left free to its own devices, creates wealth. And you've seen this extraordinary growth. I think you've now had 30 years of 6% annual GDP increase in Uganda. In other words, in a generation, you've had this incredible accumulation of prosperity. You've got a very prosperous middle class there now. And, when I talk to people I know in Uganda about the bad old days, if they remember them, they understand what it's like. Young people I talk to in Uganda simply just can't imagine what it was like. And it's because of the free market. The free market has lifted that country out of poverty and put it on a pathway to prosperity.
That's really wonderful. And I mean, what actually is the free market? Could you define that for me?
If you are wanting to give a definition of the free market, I think it's allowing people to do what is in their best interest, allowing them to allocate their time doing what they want without restriction, without restraint, without needing a permit, allow them to buy and sell off people, whether the people that they want to buy and sell off happen to live in their country or live on the other side of the planet. The free market is allowing people to pursue their own interests. And if you allow people to pursue their own interests, everyone benefits. If, on the other hand, you have a government that tries to define what is in the common good, that's when your problems come.
So it sounds like a no-brainer, but as we know, of course, that's not always the case. And there are political incentives for protectionism, for subsidies for particular industries, for governments to restrict the way in which individuals and entrepreneurs are allowed to trade across borders. Yeah. Why does this happen? Well,
you saw this quite recently, I think, in Kenya, where Kenya sugar farmers were complaining about cheap imports from Uganda, and they were putting pressure on politicians to restrict the free flow of sugar. It's easy to understand why that comes about. You have a vested interest that doesn't want to lose market share, so it gets the government, which has a monopoly on power, to use that power to keep out foreign competition. But actually, I think the rest of us need to understand that if you do that, it's harmful to everyone. If you want to understand, if you're in a low-income, poor sub-Saharan African country and you want to understand why Uganda's doing really well and why the West has done phenomenally well, there's no magic to it. It's not because of the climate. It's not because, Western countries have exploited other countries and taken their wealth. I certainly don't think anyone can accuse Uganda of doing that. It's a simple trick. The way to get wealthy is to allow foreigners to sell you stuff cheaply. If you allow foreigners to sell you stuff cheaply, it raises your living standards. The reason why here in London or people in America have high living standards is because they're able to buy stuff from China, from Japan, from Korea, from India, from each other, from pretty much anywhere around the world. And whether it's a cell phone produced by someone through a global supply chain or whether it's food produced on the other side of the planet, that's what allows people in the West to be wealthy. And if you want your country to be wealthy, try that very simple trick. Allow foreigners to sell you stuff. Take away the tariffs, take away the restrictions, allow imports. Stop thinking like a medieval monarch that imports are bad and exports are good. Exports are only good because they pay for the imports. Imports are the key. Get a lot of cheap imports. That is what raises your living standards. Forget this kind of machismo, this idea that you have to sell things. That way of thinking is mercantilism, and it impoverishes a society. Allow your consumers to buy from around the world, and if you do that, a strange thing will happen. Your exports will grow too, because as you import more, you will begin to export more. Do both, not one.
And you often somehow get better at the things that you export, so because you're no longer having to worry about the things that you import.
Absolutely. If you allow foreigners to sell you things that they produce better than you, you can then allocate your resources to doing the things that you do really well. And this is how countries specialize. They specialize and they exchange, and they become really rich and prosperous. Even in this day and age, after sort of 250 years, 300 years of the UK doing this, you still get politicians in Britain today who think, actually, no, it's all about promoting exports. It's deeply depressing, but if you really want to become prosperous, specialize and exchange, buy stuff from foreigners.
And it's actually what Adam Smith argued against those pesky mercantilists when he was saying that actually it is in our own self-interest to cooperate and trade with one another. And so, of course, within African nations, when you've got politically unstable situations, actually, when you allow for free trade to prosper, you also have those positive consequences of actually allowing for there to be more peace and harmony as well.
Absolutely.
Could you tell me a little bit about what you think the positive consequences of free trade could be?
Well, I think Richard Cobden basically said something along the lines of, if you allow goods and services to cross borders peacefully, you reduce the chances of armies crossing borders not so peacefully, words to that effect. And what he meant by that is, if you become dependent upon foreigners for your imports, and they become dependent on you for what you export, the chances of you going to war are much reduced. They're not impossible, but it's not a coincidence that countries that practice free trade have not really gone to war with other countries that practice free trade. Now, sometimes free trade is not geopolitically practical. I understand why some people look at the behavior of some countries like North Korea and Iran and say, hang on, we can't trade freely with them. And I get that. But generally speaking, if the great powers of the world are trading openly and freely with one another, they have far less of an interest in conflict. In fact, they've got a vested interest in minimizing and reducing conflict.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a bit earlier about non-tariff trade barriers and the way in which, classically we think about trade barriers as being a particular government regulation or a quota or even a subsidy that is preventing one particular industry in one country from competing with another due to those subsidies. But actually a lot of business that occurs in Africa and in a lot of African nations is informal. They're operating in the informal market. And that also then lends them to, first of all, the lack of legal protection, but also these non-tariff trade barriers, this corruption at the border, this requirements for bribery. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think anyone who's got experience of trying to import and export things through Mombasa or done a lot of transactions across the border posts knows exactly what you're talking about. The demand for bribes and backhanders, you call this euphemistically a non-tariff barrier. Corruption inhibits free trade. It allows someone who can utilize state power to deny somebody the freedom to trade unless they get a parasitic payback. And this is a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem, though. I mean, I think if you reduce the extent to which government regulates trade generally, you reduce those potential friction points. If you don't need a permit to ship goods from Kenya to Tanzania, if you don't need government permission to trade from a francophone African country to an anglophone African country, you diminish the opportunities for a corrupt official to insert themselves into the equation. So
you did use somebody on the border checking for that permit in the first place, and so you remove the potential, at least, for corruption at that border as well. This also lends itself then to a discussion on property rights, because it also means that generally speaking, if a country has a standard rule of law, or if they protect property rights, investors feel a lot more comfortable investing in that country. Why is it so important then that property rights are also respected, as well as opening up and reducing those trade barriers, sort of simultaneously? I
mean, in a free market capitalist system, if someone is going to allocate their capital and invest their capital, they need to know what the risks are and what the return is. And unless they can make an intelligent estimate as to what those are, they'll find somewhere else to invest their capital. If you want to attract outside investors, they need certainty. You deny them certainty if you have a legal system that is arbitrary. So property rights and being able to go to a court and enforce those property rights is key. Say, for example, you invest in a flower farm in Kenya. Kenya, touch wood, has a pretty good system of redress. If someone came onto your land and expropriated your farm, you could do something about it. If you were to make a similar investment in maybe Zimbabwe, the chances of you being able to have any legal redress would be pretty small. So guess what? People are investing in Kenya and not Zimbabwe. But I think one of the great advantages that Africa has is precisely that it is, I think 40-something different states. And I think you could begin to get, and are beginning to get, a sort of systems competition. The countries like Rwanda and Uganda and Kenya that, generally speaking, respect property rights and respect the rights of outside investors are starting to do really quite well. The countries in Africa that don't do that, they're the investment and economic backwaters. So I think so long as you don't have a kind of a trade bloc mentality, so long as different countries are able to set their own trade policies in Africa, I think you will start to get this virtuous upward competition, and you're starting to see that already. If South Africa continues to treat its entrepreneurs and its farmers badly, Botswana will benefit. Other African countries will benefit. I noticed that Zambia seems to be doing quite well, and I think that's probably a direct result of how badly Zimbabwe has treated some of its wealth creators.
That's really interesting. I think the way in which businesses are operating at the moment, we see the work that the IATP's partners are doing in order to try and foster free trade policies, but also actually just making it easier for businesses to operate in the formal market. Could you tell me, why you think that operating in the formal market is so much more important than in the informal market? What are the differences, and why is there that difference there?
Well, I think, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, the formal market has certainty. It has rules. It has transparency. People know where they stand. The informal market is an economy where to get things done, it's not what you know, it's who you know. An outside investor is not going to feel comfortable in that. Apart from anything, in many Western countries, if they engage in behaviour that local national authorities back home could regard as corrupt, they'll be breaking the law back in their own countries. But you need to have certainty. Capital needs to have certainty, and it's not just Western capital. I mean, African capital needs to have certainty. You see a growing middle class and an entrepreneurial class and a wealthy class of Africans in Kenya and Uganda, and other African countries. If they don't have certainty in their own countries, they're going to take what surplus capital they have and put it in the Gulf, or put it in London, or put it in Paris. You need to have that well-regulated formal economy so that African capital can stay in Africa.
That's fascinating. That's, I think, really interesting the way in which that works, because, of course, again, a lot of our IATP partners are doing exactly that in order to try and foster free trade, but also, again, allowing businesses to operate and making it easier, for businesses to operate in the formal market. For example, Liberty Sparks is based in Tanzania, and they've set up centres in order to try and help entrepreneurs register their businesses and enter into that formal market. So again, I mean, there are many individuals out there across the African continent that are doing absolutely fantastic work to try and foster free trade and free markets. What do you think the future of African trade could look like?
I mean, the potential's vast. I mean, just look at Africa physically. It is a huge continent, and it's also very diverse. If you look at Africa by region, there's a huge range of, you've got, North Africa, which is Arabic speaking.
Where I'm from.
West Africa, very, very different from Central and Eastern Africa. Southern Africa. It could be a huge free trade success story. Unfortunately, partly because of the past, partly because of the nature of some of the regimes that run some African countries, there's never really been the trade within Africa that there should be. By removing barriers to trade, you could create this extraordinary wealth-creating machine in Africa. In recent years, China has massively increased its exports to Africa, and many African countries now, their closest trading partner is China. if you look at a map of Africa and each country represented with a flag by its closest trading partner, you see a sea of Chinese flags. That's great. It's good that people in Africa are able to buy from Chinese suppliers. But imagine if it was as easy for a country in Francophone West Africa to trade with an Anglophone country in East Africa as it is with those two countries to trade with China. If you could do that, then you would see a real explosion of wealth. If the number one trading partner of African countries were neighboring African countries, you would see, and that's not to say that trade with non-African players is a bad thing, it's a very good thing. But if trade with fellow African countries was as frictionless, it would be extraordinary.
And of course, the prospect that the African Free Trade Continental Agreement actually provides Africa as a continent itself, it does mean that those incredibly diverse nations will then also be able to trade more freely with one another as well.
And I don't think it's just about tariff barriers that's a problem, but I think one of the biggest restrictions that you find are that you require different certification in different territories. I mean, I work for a state-based think tank in America, and it came as a shock to me to discover that if you are qualified as a hairdresser in one state, you may not be allowed to practice in another state. And we've recently done something to change this in Mississippi, so that if you're certified out of state, you can pretty much automatically be certified in state. Imagine if you did something similar for Africa. Imagine if you were a doctor who was qualified in Egypt or qualified in Nigeria, and you could automatically practice medicine in Kenya or South Africa. If you had automatic recognition of qualifications in different African countries, that's the kind of barrier that we also need to get rid of, because that acts as a huge restriction, not just for medicine, for accountancy, for architects. If you remove not just trade barriers on goods, but restrictions on services. If you can sell a financial service product in Kenya, why can't you automatically sell it in Uganda? If you remove those restrictions, that's often the real inhibitor to free trade.
Absolutely. So it's not only tariffs, not only non-tariff trade barriers, but also different types of regulation, the way in which those industries are regulated themselves as well. Well, I think it sounds as though, fingers crossed, it looks as though the fantastic work that our partners are doing, but also the way in which trade is naturally occurring in many of those countries themselves, it actually looks as though we might be able to see if the future of Africa where free trade is more possible. Yeah. It also then has an impact on poverty. Could you tell me just a little bit about what you think the impact on poverty could be with regard to the way in which free markets occur? If
you looked at GDP per person growth in Africa in the 60s and the 70s and for much of the 80s, it was a pretty grim story. In fact, after the 20 or 30 years after independence in a number of African countries, per capita GDP actually fell because the population was growing faster than GDP growth. What's really extraordinary about Africa in the past 20 or 30 years is the extent to which per capita GDP has started to rise. And that's often with very significant increases in population. But the economy in many African countries is now growing faster than the rate of population growth. And this is really encouraging. This is what happened in the Netherlands 300 years ago, and Britain and America 250 years ago. We call it the Industrial Revolution. It happened in China in the 1980s and 1990s. It's now happening in sub-Saharan Africa. You can only really achieve that in Africa, per capita GDP increases, if you have more free trade. And I think it's no coincidence that as you've seen the liberalization of markets in Africa, partly because of initiatives like this one, but also partly technology, the advent of M-Pesa as a payment system, for example, digital technology allowing farmers in one part of Africa to know what the price of a product is in their region, people being able to buy things directly from the supplier in China rather than going through a middleman. Technology and regulation has increased trade, and I think this helps explain why it is that what was a dismal story of 30 years of failure in Africa at the end of the last century has now become actually a story of success in the 21st century. But for it to be sustained, you need even more concerted efforts at removing these restrictions on trade across the continent.
Douglas, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for watching this interview today. If you're interested in this kind of content and would like to hear more, hit subscribe to the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity YouTube channel. Thank you.